Beautiful.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Can everyone see that start of the PowerPoint screen? Perfect. All right, so I guess to start us off with today, we have what we call a whakatoki or a karakia. So this is a Māori are the Indigenous people of New Zealand, as most of you probably know. I am not Māori, and Jackie and Tabitha are also not Māori. I am tangata te tiriti o Waitangi, which means a person of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is our kind of founding document. So the purpose of doing a whakatoki, which kind of translates loosely to sort of words of wisdom or a proverb, or a karakia, which is slightly more of a prayer, but it's really about bringing together our energy or our modi, which is translates to somewhere between our spirit and our energy, kind of our vibe. So it's about bringing ourselves and putting ourselves in the space that we're ready to do whatever the purpose of the meeting is. So in this case, to share, to learn, to discuss and reflect. So the one we picked for today says, "Mā te ako ka marama, mā te marama ka matou, mā te matou ka ora," which means through learning comes understanding, through understanding comes knowledge and wisdom, through knowledge and wisdom comes life and well-being. So the next part, which I think you probably will have all done, it seems like you all kind of know each other a little bit, but is around whanaungatanga, which is all about connections. Connections is sort of too small of a word to really encompass what whanaungatanga means. But is a really important part, and I guess in Māori culture, acknowledging that we are not just an individual, but we come with our whole selves when we enter a room anywhere, and we also come with those who came before us and those who have contributed to our lives and our whānau, our families, and all of those sorts of things as well. So I will introduce myself in Te Reo Māori, and then we can all kind of do a bit of introducing. So kia ora koutou, ko rangitoto te monga, ko pupuke te roto no tamaki makaurau ahau, ko Barnes toku whānau, ko hana toku ingoa. Kia ora everyone. So that means basically, hello, good morning, everyone. I reference my mountain. So I live in Auckland, and Rangitoto Island, the volcano that's kind of in the middle of all the cool pictures of Auckland, is the mountain that I kind of see most days. And then my lake, or my body of water, is Lake Pupuke, where I sometimes like to go for a walk around there. I live in Tamaki Makaurau, which is Auckland. My family is Barnes, and my name is Hannah. So that's kind of just introducing myself, and the purpose of doing that introduction around where you're from. There's lots of different versions of exactly what people put in there, but the purpose is around bringing your whole self and then being able to find those connections. And often if you sort of go around a room and all introduce yourselves properly, then you're like, oh, my nana came from there, or you find all of these little ways to connect as people, which then can create that kind of shared space for good connection and learning. So I am Hannah, and I'm the practice lead of the speech and language therapy team at Spectrum Care. So we support adults with both their eating and drinking, as well as their communication, which we'll be talking about a lot today. I think Tabitha and Jackie, does everyone already know you guys? You're both on mute.
Sorry. I think we have all met in the past, but I do think going around and introducing yourself isn't a bad thing, especially with having you here. So shall we go and introduce ourselves?
Yeah, if you want to introduce yourselves quickly, and then I have, can you now see that Kahoot page?
Yeah.
Right, so has everyone used Kahoot before? It's just a quick online quiz thing. Sorry, I meant to put this in the chat earlier. If you have your phone on you, just pop in, just Google search kahoot.com.
I think Hannah is at kahoot.it.
Is it?
Yeah, it's IT. Kahoot.it.
Oh, yes.
Kahoot.com takes you to a different place.
There's the place where you can make the quizzes and the place where you can log into the quizzes.
I see.
Then which one did you click on? The top one. And then
And if you haven't used Kahoot before, this will give you a little flavour, and I'm sure you'll be an absolutely avid user beyond this.
Wonderful. So Caroline's in, Tabitha's in.
I will take a quick second to reintroduce myself. So kia ora everybody, I'm Tabitha Murray. I have been with Spectrum Care for almost 12-ish years. And I am from the United States. I moved to New Zealand 12 years ago, and this was my second job after getting into the country.
And I'll just join in. Morena ko Clint te mona, ko Stawa te awa, ko Wordsley te iwi, ko Jakimaska Yangaho. So I've just been describing where I'm from, which is a village called Wordsley, with Clint as my Clint Hills as my local mountain, not quite a mountain, more like a little hill. And the River Stour that kind of runs through where I was born. But I've been here in Tamaki Makaurau for nearly 11 years, and with Spectrum 4 years.
And I have to say something, because you talked about connections and that when people say stuff, I used to work at Sunfield School in the Clent Hills.
Excellent. There we go. Have a connection, Karen, and I knew it.
Exactly the purpose of doing this kind of thing. Wonderful. All right, I think it looks like everyone's in. Nellie and Lisa, if you're on your phones, I'm not sure that you can double join, but that's okay. All right, so we will get started on this. So the first few questions are just quite open, just around connection and giving everyone the chance to share with the group. So where are you from? I think we're a small enough group, we've already said, but you should be able to wiggle around that picture on your screen so that you can drop your pin. Is that working for people? This is the first time I've used the pin dropping feature.
Yeah, it was my first time seeing it, and it's pretty cool.
It's been submitted, Hannah. We'll see when it arrives.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Wonderful. So we can see we've got here. Couple in the.
She's in the States. Oh, I didn't go high enough. Oh no.
Deb's pretending she's in the States. She's actually
Mine just dropped randomly. I did not pick that. So green.
Oh no.
Henna, I can't find a pin.
Oh, okay. And are you from New Zealand?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful and lovely Aotearoa, which was difficult to find a map that had that on it, but we are there. All right, on to the next one. So brainstorm, you can type in anything. What's your favorite food?
And Nellie and Lisa, maybe we'll just have to ask you what your favorite food is. We can't hear you.
Cheese.
Cheese.
Oh, yeah. Any cheese.
All right, Filipino, crab legs, chips and dip, risotto, curry, white chicken meat, Caesar salad. Interesting. You guys have all gone really healthy. Like chocolate or ice cream or pies on there. Yes, it indicates the different time of the day as well where everyone's at. All right, we can ignore the point. So then the next question is just in 2 words. Why are you here today? Little countdown here, so we've got 45 seconds left to answer.
And we can do more than one on this one, it looks like.
Oh,
I did it wrong. I put both words on the first one.
Are you having any luck there, Canada crew?
Oh, I put, yeah.
Sometimes it takes us Canadians a while to understand.
Oh dear.
I did that too.
Yeah, no, I put 3 words actually.
That's allowed. We'll forgive you for that.
Yeah, I put both of my words in the first box and then realized.
All right, so we've got lots of to learn, to connect, sharing. Jackie asked, get ideas, fun. That's good. I feel like with a small group as well, it's easier to keep it kind of nice and light. Brainstorming and something new. Awesome. So hopefully we can kind of cover all of those things today. And then thinking now more around the topic of our session today, what is communication? No right or wrong answers necessarily. What does communication mean to you?
One word?
Many words.
You can kind of just put as many as you want.
I've been kicked out, Hannah, of Kahoot.
You've been kicked
I
out
had
of
to log
Kahoot.
back in as well.
Can you go back? I think the game pin is still in the corner there.
Oh yeah, 9996674.
Oh, yes.
Oh, no, see, I didn't see that.
Oh, bird idea.
I'm on time now.
A couple more seconds.
I put all my ideas in one go and I've
That's all good.
Such
a high achiever, Caroline.
We'll be able to spot what
all in
ones
the
yours
same
are.
place.
So we've got sharing to understand each other, shared language, meeting needs, connecting, body language, expressing ourselves, actions, body language, expression, connection, listening, talking, expressing. Wonderful. Is there any other kind of key thoughts, or for those of Lisa and Nellie, anything else to kind of chip in there?
Communicate. Well, I'm going to say communicate. So
Understanding.
I didn't type quick enough. Communication is the key to everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's really great to see, like, we've got some of those methods of communication in there, like talking or body language, but it's really communication is connection. Communication is the foundation to everything else. Obviously, as a speech therapist, I'm a little bit biased, but it really is the way that we connect with everything in the world around us. It's how we direct our supports and control our lives. So then the next question, again, similar kind of train of thought. I think you kind of got it in the first one, but why do we communicate, either for yourselves or for people you support?
Very similar answers, to be fair. For these two.
And now we'll just give it a few more seconds and then it'll show us. Bear with me, I'm working across two screens. So sorry if I'm looking in the wrong direction. All right, so we've got meet our needs, get things we want, share ideas. And ideas is a really important thing. And I think something that, you know, for a lot of disabled people, we often talk about meeting their needs, but people have ideas and interests and all of those kinds of things that are really important to share as well. Build relationships, being social, getting to know each other, share our thoughts, feelings, aspirations. again, that connection, belonging, feeling loved, being heard, expressing ourselves and enjoying the world, right? It's fundamental to all of the ways that we interact. When people hear the term speech therapist, I think they often think of, you know, someone who's going to make you talk more clearly or pronounce things in a different way. But I like to think of communication is the way that every type of understanding and expressing yourself, it's every kind of learning, every kind of interaction is a form of communication. So it really is integrated into everything. And then our last question is, what makes communication difficult? Now, this can be either for you, like none of us have perfect communication, but also for the people you support. What are some of the things that make communication difficult?
Hannah, I haven't seen anything pop into the waiting room. Do you want to just check maybe your participants?
Yes,
to
I
make sure
will.
that it's not coming through to you. I see what looks like a palm tree there where Nellie is.
Am I?
Oh, yes.
Such beautiful view. It's a nice place to start the day.
It's actually a car park with some nice trees around the edge of it.
Perfect.
I don't think there is, Tabitha. All right, if we go skip, I think this will take us to the answers. All right, so not having a shared language, absolutely. That was one of my first questions for Jackie when she asked me to help with this presentation. That was an international thing. I was like, what language does everyone speak? Not understanding, not being understood, not being clear, not being able to be understood, not having the skills, the different methods which are not understood by all. And that's really important as well. I think in a very, very Western kind of medical model of disability, that certainly in New Zealand, and I imagine in most of the UK and in North and South and North America is probably the kind of lens that we are coming from and trying to change. There is often a view that, you know, it's the person who has the problem, but actually the person probably knows exactly what they want. It's the getting it between people where the problem lies. So it's, you know, both parties are involved in that, and it's not just on one person. Absolutely. Stress, exhaustion, overstimulation. How many times have we all come home at the end of a really long day, really tired, and your partner or whoever you live with starts telling you things and it just goes totally above your head and you say, oh my God, I didn't understand any of that. That happens for all of us when we're stressed, when we're tired, when we're sick, when we're angry. Our communication ability kind of goes down the cliff a little bit. People with other languages, different meanings for different words, absolutely. Different learning styles, people's understanding, finding the right words to express yourself. Physical things like hearing, absolutely. Not being receptive to the voice of the person. That's a really good point. And I think that's something that is one of those challenges that we're constantly trying to overcome is, you know, going alongside valuing the person and knowing that they are a person and they have something to say and they have important opinions that need to be listened to, and not being able to express yourself. Awesome. All right. Any other thoughts around this before we swap back to the PowerPoint?
The different meanings for different words, it really resonated with me. I can remember when I first met my husband, and he is a Kiwi and I'm American, and we were living in Ireland, and he said we both speak English, obviously, but we ran out the door and he's like, oh, I've forgotten a couple of things. Can you run inside and get my jumper and my jandals and my something else? And I was like, I don't know what any of those words mean. I don't know what you're asking for. You're going to have to go get them yourself. I'm so sorry. So even just those little differences between all English speakers can be quite complicated as well.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right, so we're back to the PowerPoint. Everyone can see the PowerPoint now? Perfect. All right, so I guess that kind of really just sets the scene, sets the mood for us a little bit around how we communicate, why we communicate. So to give you a bit of context, it sounds like most of you are relatively familiar with Spectrum Care, but we support adults with intellectual disabilities. And by that, who do we mean? First and foremost, they're people. They're interesting, they're diverse, they're funny, they have come in all shapes and sizes, just like the whole population does. We have a wide range of services, and Spectrum does have some support services for children and young people up through to aging, but most of the people that we support are adults. They're very culturally diverse, and it's typically developmental disabilities, so things like autism, Down syndrome, intellectual disability, as opposed to acquired conditions. Large variety of diagnoses, and of course, as people age, and we do have an aging population, we then get secondary things like people having strokes or people getting dementia or just general aging as well. All of the people we support need some kind of support with daily living, whether that's full-time support for all of their daily needs, or whether that's just a couple of hours a week for someone to help with, say, their budgeting or getting to the supermarket. Everyone has some kind of support needs. And many of the people we support may communicate in a way that could be described as challenging behaviour for a variety of reasons. And everyone has some kind of communication support needs. When we're thinking about communication, it's really broad. And I think, you know, if we think about our own communication, none of us have perfect communication either. And we all have communication support needs and strategies that we use to help ourselves with our memories and our interactions. And so, you know, as opposed to some other aspects of disability where you might have, you know, high or low support needs, communication is just communication needs. So most people will need some aspect of support, whether that's specialised or not, can depend person to person. So the majority of what my work is at Spectrum, and kind of the bulk of the business, is around people in supported living. So that typically looks like between 3 to 6 people with disabilities living in a house supported full-time by care staff. And our kaimahi, our staff, are also incredibly diverse. So here, while we have some incredibly skilled, highly trained staff with a lot of experience and background in disability, there's no requirement to have a particular qualification. So we have a very, very diverse workforce, a lot of whom have English as a second language, a lot of people who, you know, have come into disability because they like to be active and do stuff, and they're more of a doer rather than a sit at the computer and read lots of stuff kind of a person. So that's kind of roughly the setting. Tabitha and Jackie, is there anything else you wanted to add around the context that we're working in at Spectrum?
No, Hannah, and I think some of the people in the room as well are kind of working in similar setups, or if they're not directly within a provider, they're working alongside providers and supporting people to kind of develop ways of approaching things, ways of doing things. So that'd be a fair sum up for the people that are here today, including yourselves humanly. I can't see everyone on the screen.
Yeah, I think looks like people are nodding. All right, so then on to the exciting stuff. So describing communication. So often when we hear people talking about communication of disabled people or people with disabilities, you generally hear they're either verbal or they're non-verbal, which is kind of a good description of a person's expressive language. But for the huge range of communication that people have, Verbal and nonverbal just doesn't give us very much information, and it doesn't tell us anything about what a person's able to understand or how their communication, how to best interact and engage with them. Sometimes we hear things like mild, moderate, severe, profound, but again, those terms are quite relative, and so it's difficult to, what I think is mild is very different to what you might think of as mild. We also sometimes see, oh, my PowerPoint's on automatic. We also sometimes hear things like they're like a something-year-old, but as we know, it doesn't quite work. We know very clearly that a 50-year-old man who doesn't use words to communicate is not the same as a 6-month-old baby. It's just not right. They have life experience. It's different. So we don't want to use age comparisons. But we do need to have a good foundational understanding of how a person communicates in order to provide the right services, the right supports, and to really be able to engage with them in a real way. So at Spectrum, the speech and language therapy team, about 2 years ago, we started a project around developing some more appropriate communication descriptors to better understand our population and individuals. So we developed 6 descriptors about a person's receptive language, or what a person understands, and 6 about how they express themselves. The focus is on language, so a person's knowledge of words, concepts, rather than their physical speech production, so how clearly they can say the words. So we knew that our descriptors needed to be strengths-based and focus on what a person can do. We knew they needed to be person-centered and something that was suitable for all languages. So if a person spoke any kind of language, but also if they were deaf and they used sign language, or they used an AAC, alternative and augmentative communication device with pictures, or any other kind of form of communication. We knew that they needed to be relatively quick and easy to collect. In Aotearoa, there is almost no funding for adults to access speech therapy, so it definitely couldn't be something that they needed like a full individualized assessment to be able to determine what that descriptor was. We needed it to provide enough information that it gave clear information for clinical use, so things like the speech therapy team, as well as behaviour support, medical teams, but also be broad enough that it could fit into categories that can help with sort of whole service planning. And then we needed it to be simple enough that it could be understood by all kinds of different people, not just speech therapists with sort of speech therapy jargon. So with those criteria, we didn't find any other descriptors that quite met what we were looking for. So we developed our own. So our first descriptor is around receptive language, and it's always important to think about what a person understands first. The understanding is almost the foundational bit and is the harder bit to figure out. So we start with people who attend to others and the environment. So these might be people who sort of generally keep to themselves. They respond to noises, to touch. If you put the shoes on their feet, they're like, oh, must be going out. If a person walks in the door, they'll recognize them, but they really need things to physically happen to experience them in the here and now. We then have people who understand and anticipate some of their familiar events and routines. So they might seem like they understand instructions like set the table or sweep the floor or whatever it is, but actually most of these kind of people, they might not be understanding the words, but they're more relying on their memory, or, if you're pointing and you're grabbing their towel and pointing at the shower and saying it's time to go have a shower, they're following all those gestures and prompts and the cues in the environment to understand what's happening. We then have people who can understand words and phrases in context. So if you're talking about stuff that's in the here and now, they might understand, like if you ask them to go fetch your shoes and you're obviously getting ready to go out, that kind of thing might make sense. But my question here is often when you get in the car, does the person know where they're going, or do they have to wait until they turn up and then you see their reaction to where they've arrived? We then get people who understand words and phrases and can understand stuff out of context. So those familiar, motivating words, whether they be good or bad, so maybe they know McDonald's, maybe they know hospital or dentist, and they know they definitely don't want that. These people will often be able to get the general gist of what you're saying, so they can kind of follow along because they know those key words, but not necessarily following all the detail of a conversation. We've then got people who can understand simple, concrete language. So understand and follow conversations about simple or familiar topics. So if they're really, really into trains, maybe they can have quite a good conversation about trains. But if you started to talk about planning a holiday next month to somewhere they've never been, maybe that would be a bit more challenging. So it's things that they're familiar with. And then we've got people who can understand complex abstract language. So people who with support can engage in things like politics, their health decisions, goal planning, all of those kind of quite complex things. But the important thing here is they do still have communication support needs. They might still need a bit of extra processing time. They may still need things to be broken down and made clear for them. So those are our 6 descriptors that we use to help us get an understanding of receptive language. We then have expressive language. So this one can be a little bit easier to see. So we've got people who are pre-intentional. So those are people who don't necessarily initiate communication. They're probably not communicating on purpose. It's pre-intent. But if you're a person who knows them well, you can tell what they want because maybe they pull a face when you make a bad dinner. Maybe they kind of pull away or look droopy when they're a bit bored. So you can still gauge what the person is thinking if you're one of those familiar communication partners. We've then got people who express themselves in a unique, intentional way. Now, this is the biggest group of people that we're supporting at Spectrum. So unique, intentional is those people who are really communicating on purpose, but in their own way. So it's often the people who will come and grab you by the hand and lead you to something to show you. Maybe they'll bring you something if they want you to look at it. They'll hand you their cup when they're ready for another drink. Maybe they have a particular sign or a happy noise or a sad noise that as a familiar person, you recognize they're definitely communicating, but you have to know them to know what it is. Then we've got people who communicate at single words, and this could be they're communicating in simple sign language, or they're pointing at different pictures, or it might be verbal speech. We then have people who communicate in short phrases, so they're combining different words, but also probably still relying quite a lot on their facial expression, their body language, and all of those things to support communication as well. And then we have people who can have a basic conversation, so they can have a simple discussion about the topics that are familiar or of interest to them. And then people who can have a complex conversation about most things, but again, they might still have some support needs. So it's through the combination of what does a person understand and how do they express themselves that we start to get a much better understanding of what that person's communication looks like. So for instance, if you have a person who can understand basic conversation, but they have a physical disability and so they can't physically say the words, and so they're at a unique intentional in how they express themselves, that's a very, very different picture to someone who really needs to, understands their routines, can follow objects and gestures and prompts, but they repeat words. So, very echolalic, and they might be saying a lot of words, but their understanding is quite different. So it's the combination of the two that I think really helps us piece together what a person's communication is like. So with these communication descriptors, there's a few important things to consider. So it's not meant to be a complete assessment. It's certainly not a capacity assessment, but it gives us a really good starting place where we can start to figure out what the person can do and how we can support them. It's not a capacity assessment. And we also want to recognize that communication is not necessarily just a continuum. If you guys are familiar with the newer kind of circle model of autism, where instead of, high functioning, low functioning, we've got that, all of the different areas that people might be quite skilled in or might have challenges in. And I think communication is really similar to that. So we've got language skills, but we also might be impacted by a person's social interactions, their attention, their memory, and their life experience as well. If you have never ever been given control of your money, your ability to manage money is not necessarily because of your intellectual disability or because of your limited understanding, just because none of us could manage money the first time we were ever given it. So all important things to consider. The communication descriptors are not necessarily fixed, so it's not meant to be a label that we stamp on someone and then that's how they communicate for life. But the focus is really on understanding where the person is at rather than changing it. So when we understand what a person can understand, then we can adapt our support to try and bring it to a person's level. Sometimes we do see, change, but really the focus is understanding them and tailoring the support needs to them. All right, so I think that's a good kind of chunk of information. Keen to hear your thoughts now, open it up for a bit of discussion. I guess interested to hear from you guys. Do these communication descriptors align with sort of your experiences and some of the people that you support? And how can understanding a person's communication improve what support they're getting? And then any other general sort of comments, questions, or feedback. So open floor to you guys.
I suppose I will confess I'm also a fellow speechy. So
Wonderful to see.
That's my my clinical background. I find I have two different jobs. I still practice as a speech and language therapist in autism, but the job that I'm kind of here under the umbrella of is I am a person-centered planner, and I work across an adult service, and it's predominantly physical disability. So we have a lot of adults with cerebral palsy who maybe communicate in different ways. The thing I find professionally as not for myself personally, but for the staff that I work with and have to kind of support is they really struggle with the adults that don't use words and may have more kind of subtle ways of communicating, the kind of more sensory ways. And I find it very frustrating because you can see that these adults are amazing communicators in their own way, but they maybe don't, because they find it more difficult to kind of tune into the more unusual or idiosyncratic ways they communicate.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like I think sometimes what do we define as communication, and for so many people that is talking. And so part of this is also just acknowledging everyone does communicate, and often we hear people using sort of all or nothing language, like, oh, they understand everything or they understand nothing, when actually that's, you just asked this guy 4 times if he wants to sit in this chair. Like, I don't think he's understanding everything. And in the same way, just because a person's not talking does not mean they're not communicating. So one of our key points there is, potentially as we move forward, anyone who does communicate in a unique way, providing like a communication profile or a communication passport of some description that is the people who know that person best, kind of writing out what are all those unique ways that they communicate, because it is a valid form of communication, and we need to think a bit more creatively about what is acceptable communication. The only thing we're really working towards is effective communication, whatever that looks like for the person. But yeah, I think these have helped sort of anecdotally. I think that these descriptors have helped some of our support staff to, I guess, think through all of those layers of communication. I know I was talking with a team the other day, and we went through for the day program that these people went to, we went through 50 people and we said, what are the descriptors for all of them? And by the end, one of the guys said to me, he was like, oh, it's so interesting, like it just think about it in such a different way, and I feel like I'm thinking about them in ways that I hadn't before, and I'm going to notice different things now. So it's just around shifting your thinking and kind of knowing what it is that you're looking for.
And I've come across one thing that I've kind of found useful within my practice, which I think is a really lovely tool, and it's free on the internet, is you know the pragmatics profile.
Yes.
Well, there's the ACE Centre in the UK have done a lovely adapted version for AAC. And so it gives all the descriptors under the questions about how a person who uses alternative means to communicate may like show social intention. And I've actually started doing that as part of the person-centered planning, which is completely like crossing over into another role. But it's really worth looking up because it's really, the adaptation they've done to it's really good.
Wonderful. I'll definitely get in touch and try and get a hold of that. Yeah. How about the rest of you? Any other kind of thoughts or comments?
Just love to make a quick contribution before we actually go. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I think Nellie jumped in first there.
Oh, oh, hi. So we're getting some terrible feedback. That's terrible.
Yeah. If everyone else puts
because one of
themselves on
you-
mute.
Yeah. It'll be because you're both in the same car, so you'd need to mute the sound on the other phone as well.
This has been a fabulous conversation. I'm not quite sure what's happening. It is muted. Yeah. Okay. We won't contribute. It's going to be.
Maybe if you just had one phone, we would still be able to see and hear both of you, but you wouldn't get the feedback. No. Now no phones. Okay, that's all right. One of the things that I can say about being at Spectrum Care, so prior to having the communication descriptors, we had just these little sort of tick boxes that didn't mean a whole lot of things. And one of the things that Hannah and I found, so when staff in the houses are actually filling in some of the assessments, they put in the communication descriptors that they think, and we were like, oh, they'll be very different from what the speech and language therapists have put in for these communication descriptors. But when we actually compared them, they weren't all that different, which for me means that even our staff that are working in the houses that don't have SLT backgrounds, that don't have sometimes even any formal education in relation to working with people with disabilities or communication, are able to understand them as well, which was a big game changer from using quite formal language as well.
Yeah, that was a real big win when we were able to get that report and have a look at. So I've got a big spreadsheet that has all of the people we support and what the speech therapy team think their descriptors are. But when that was able to come from the staff, the closeness was really good. It was really quite cool to see that key one of those 7 things that we needed was for people outside the speech therapy profession to be able to use these to kind of relatively accurately kind of gauge their thinking and give them kind of a reference point. So that was really cool to see that it looked like that part had been at least partially achieved.
Canada team, I think we heard you almost say something before.
Say that understanding a person's communication can also improve the building of the relationships, which also builds the trust of understanding, but also the trust between the support and the person that you're building the relationship with.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. And I think trust is such an important part. And I don't think we take the time to reflect enough on just how much trust we are expecting these people to give, and these, often very frequent changing of support staff, and they have these strangers effectively coming into their house and supporting them with all of their very personal and important needs, and we're expecting them to trust that person, but then don't trust the random person you meet on the internet because they're different for some reason. But I think, yeah, absolutely, giving the new staff member as well kind of an indication of what the person can do and what to look out for can help people get to know each other more quickly as well. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we kind of move on to some of the things that we've done? Yeah, Carol.
Just quickly here, and I just found it really fascinating, and because I've been thinking how often we don't do the best in terms of making information easy,
accessible. Yeah,
and then we're wanting to give people decision making over their lives, but that communication is so important.
Absolutely. So I think in Aotearoa in New Zealand, we're in a big sort of transformative place in our disability services. So we've got a new kind of health structure, and we have a new ministry for disability called Whaikaha. And, you know, with things like enabling good lives principles, there's a big focus in the sector on being person-centered, on, you know, their autonomy, their decision making, their control over their own lives. But how do we support decision making if actually you don't know how a person communicates? And I know that myself, I've been a little bit maybe frustrated is not quite the right word, but I suppose reading some documents or some things on official websites sometimes, I'm thinking not everyone can access this information. Not everyone, you know, when you're talking about including people in this way, what about all these other people with a different kind of style of communication? How are we supporting and upskilling support staff and organizations to understand who are they trying to support and how do they do that in different creative ways? And I think as well, you know, as a speech therapist, I have a lot of training and we have knowledge around communication and how communication works. But I really see our role as we are the facilitators or the connectors between sort of what the person can do and everyone else's jobs. So it's things like Caroline, the, you know, personal planning and goal planning and stuff. As a speech therapist, my job is certainly not to plan anyone's goals for them, but it's around taking anything, whether it's goal planning, whether it's a medication review, whether it's input into the new policy, and figuring out how do we make this more accessible. So really seeing ourselves as slotting into every aspect of life and every aspect of support, and making things accessible. So in terms of what we've actually done, so embedding the communication descriptors into practice. So so far, we have communication descriptors for all of the 460 odd people who are in supported accommodation. We've also collected communication descriptors for all of our aspirations programs. So those are our kind of day services, vocational programs. And in the future, we'll be looking to do that for our respite services as well. We are writing this up in a research paper with a couple of the universities here in Aotearoa. And hoping to have that published relatively soon. At the moment, it's sitting with the Journal of Intellectual Disabilities awaiting review. So if we think about, like Tabitha said, we had some previous sort of descriptions of communication, like if the person was nonverbal or some words, or if they had no disability. So from that, as we've changed, it's been really cool to see the actual impact on people. So I've got a few kind of examples of different people and how understanding their communication better has changed the support we provide for them. Excuse the busy slide, you don't have to read this all, but basically we had our first example is someone who was a 31-year-old woman with autism and an intellectual disability, previously described as just being nonverbal. Once we looked at her communication descriptors, she's the sort of person that attends to familiar events and routines. So she needs things to happen in the moment for her to understand what's happening, but she can follow those gestures and prompts if you set up the environment for her. Her expressive language is pre-intentional. So you really need people who know her well to figure out what does that facial expression mean when she does this, what is she kind of meaning. So by having that improved understanding of what she could understand, we led to some better staff training and a greater understanding of what supports were likely to be suitable. A big focus on using objects and sort of setting up her environment so that she could see what was going to happen rather than just being told what was going to happen. And really focusing on engaging and interaction, a lot of that kind of active support. Not sure if you guys will have heard of intensive interaction. Caroline, you probably have, but it's kind of a sort of a speech therapy approach to really just focusing on that engagement and connection with the person without formal means of communication like speech or signs or anything like that. So it's just around building the environment and setting those expectations of the staff around how they can best support her. Another example of a man who was 54, he has cerebral palsy and intellectual disability, and he is deaf. So he was also described as nonverbal previously, but actually he understands words and phrases, so he can think about things outside of context. He can think about what he wants to do tomorrow or next week. And he can use short phrases, so he can point to pictures and recognize symbols pretty well. And he also has a really interesting mix of UK sign, British sign, New Zealand sign, and Australian sign. So a little bit unique, but still kind of a formal means of communication. And now that we have that understanding of what he can understand, we are able to make sure that staff have the right access to sign language training. We've put in a new communication system called POD, which again, Caroline, I'm sure that you've heard of, but kind of a comprehensive communication system that can match his receptive language, and increasing his engagement and involvement in decisions. There was one example for this gentleman where they were really trying to get a stool sample, and he was getting incredibly distressed. He had no idea what they were trying to do, and it's quite invasive. It was quite stressful for him. And by understanding his communication descriptors, just made him a really simple visual schedule of like, this is what we need to do so that it can be taken to the doctor. And within 5 minutes, he'd gone and got it himself and was happy as. So the power of knowing how a person understands can be so important for both their well-being and also their health, so that they can engage in medical support, which we know is a massive area of concern for people with disabilities. Another example of a 25-year-old woman with an intellectual disability. She was just described as verbal. She talked, she could have a conversation, and so people didn't really think she needed any communication support. We know that she does understand complex abstract language, and she can have a complex conversation. So she's a very, very capable and very good language skills. But with acknowledging that actually she still has communication support needs, but being strengths-based. We know she's capable, but to enable that, we need to break things down a little bit. So support was provided. So we put in some visual supports around budgeting, meal planning, shopping, and support for her to decide who she wanted to live with. So all of these kind of things, by understanding a person's communication better, we can then plan what supports are appropriate. I suppose sort of roughly, when we're thinking about receptive language and expressive language, if we first figure out where is the receptive language, then we can often bring the expressive language up to what a person can understand. So for our gentleman in the middle who could understand a lot when it was in the right format, if we just provide some supports, then he can express himself at that level as well. In terms of receptive language, sometimes that can change, but really our focus is around knowing what is the person's receptive language and then adapting it to them. So if we know that they best understand through objects and seeing what's happening, we make sure that when they're going to go out, they help us pack the bag and put in their swimming togs and put in their towel and put in their goggles, so that through those objects and that experience, they know what's going to happen. So from these descriptors, we've also developed all sorts of things like social stories about moving house, which happens quite a lot. So people who have flatmates moving in and out, or people who are moving house themselves, or having their support staff change, we can kind of understand a few different kind of templates to help people access that information. We can do more targeted training for particular types of communication supports. And certainly as we move forward, I think that's probably where we're going to go to more, and looking at how to create quite an efficient service, wanting to focus on targeted training and making sure that, you know, we don't necessarily need everyone to know everything, and that's just never going to happen, especially in, you know, we've got limited time and limited staff as well. So being really clever and targeted around what training different people need. We Also trying to identify people to participate within various working groups. So our property team were really keen to get some good feedback about what people thought of their houses, and using our communication descriptors, we were able to identify people who would probably be able to participate in that kind of question. Caroline?
Sorry, I just wanted to say something. I hope you don't mind me interrupting.
No, not at all.
The thing that I tend to professionally, the point I have to kind of make with some of the adults who work with, you know yourself, with some of the adults on the autism spectrum, that their expressive indicators can give the impression that they're much more able than they're receptive. And then you have that other kind of flip side where the staff overestimate their ability based on the verbal and not the receptive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think echolalia, or those people who repeat words or phrases, can be the most kind of confusing. And I think that that's one of the real strengths, where knowing what a person can understand has been really helpful, because you're right, I think people do overestimate what a person who seems to use a lot of words can understand, and then they're underestimating that person who's sitting there. They can't physically talk, but they know everything you're saying, but they're being treated maybe in a childish kind of a way. So yeah, absolutely understanding the dynamics of that.
Yeah, Anna and Caroline as well. I think sometimes it's about the time that people need as well to process some information. I mean, we're talking about the ways in which we might communicate with a person and how they communicate with us. But, you know, an experience I had just a couple of weeks ago, someone who's so articulate can talk about very complex scenarios. But, you know, if you interrupt his flow, or if you don't give him adequate time, he can get into a bit of a cycle of really not understanding what you're asking, and really doesn't assist communication at all. So, you know, very articulate people, but have very different processing needs as well.
Absolutely, and that's where having kind of the general descriptor and then individualizing, you know, what's on a person's file, what's in a communication profile or passport or some kind of document about them is really key. Something else I was going to say. Nope, that's right. Yeah, so then we're also looking at trying to adapt our methods for collecting feedback. So things like our consumer surveys, all of these kind of things, we're trying to, you know, compare that to the descriptors and see what kind of content do we need to be asking to best engage people. So rather than saying we like to collect feedback through a survey and then, you know, who's going to answer it, start the other way and say, how do people tend to communicate and how do we capture that information? So just shifting our thinking a little bit more. Jackie, maybe you can talk to this a little bit more, but of course, one of the biggest things recently has been around COVID vaccinations and making sure that people both consent and understand what's happening. So our communication descriptors helped us to identify the people who, with support and with very clearly laid out information, could probably understand what they were consenting to. Then, you know, people who understood some words or understood simple language might understand that, you know, you're going to get an injection that's going to stop you getting sick, but keep it to that kind of simple stuff that they are likely to be able to understand, rather than things around antigens, et cetera, et cetera. And then people who probably weren't going to be able to make an informed decision about, you know, in the future I might get sick because there's a sickness around, lots of abstract kind of concepts. But they did need to be informed, like, you're going to go to the doctors, you're going to get an injection, and then this is going to happen. So really tailoring the information to the different people. I think personally, one of my big things that I'm big on is, you know, the only thing that's more dangerous than, you know, not getting people's consent is pretending that you have got someone's consent when actually they don't know what they're consenting to, or they've just kind of nodded because you were telling them to say yes. So knowing when we have got consent and knowing we've tried everything we can, but we don't think that this person genuinely understands this particular scenario.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was a global effort to consider whether people wanted to be vaccinated or not. And here in Aotearoa, we had a whole group of people who were looking at equity for people to be able to receive the vaccination, but also ways in which people could be supported to think about whether they did or did not want to have the COVID vaccination. Very unlike probably the last 50 years or more, where people have probably been vaccinated quite easily, and haven't really been that heavily involved in the decision. So as Hannah said, we definitely within Spectrum Care utilised all the awesome communication descriptors to help us figure out which tools would probably suit people, and kind of gave a bit more of a focused flow of information to staff to say, start with this. We think this is a good way to assist that person to understand what the vaccination is all about, and try to give them time as well to think about whether they would want to go forward with it. One of the support workers that we were talking, as was a support worker at the time, and he was talking about it took, maybe 6 conversations with the person, and finally that person was able, through gestures, to kind of indicate what they knew was going to happen when they got to the vaccination site, by sort of touching their arm and kind of understanding, yes, something's going to happen, I'm going to get an injection. But it was really helpful, and it really just was gave us an honest overview of whether somebody could or couldn't make a decision. We had people who made the decision that they did not want to be vaccinated, and we respected that, although equally we made sure that they understood, if you don't, this maybe is, might happen if you do get sick. But they still stood by that decision, and we completely supported them with that. Lots of people were able to decide and go forward, but even on the day of vaccination, if a person hesitated, pulled away, wasn't having a bar of it, we were honoured and respected that too. It really helped us, and then if we ascertained that the person was not able to make that decision for themselves, not able to grab the concept, we referred to whether they had kind of welfare guardianships, where there's a legal involvement from somebody to make a decision with the person, or whether we went to kind of 4 people that knew that person well and gathered and gained their views. So it was a really considered process. I feel like it was probably, truthfully, the first time in Aotearoa where we truly had communicated with, tried to assist people to understand and express their decision around a health procedure, probably unlike anything else we've ever had before. And I think, stands us in good stead for the way we should do things from here on, really, as well.
Absolutely. And I think rightly, a lot of people were asking like, oh, well, what do we do for everything else? And the answer was not necessarily especially great across the country, and our understanding of consent is really complicated with whatever kind of area you're talking about. If we're thinking about informed decision making, I'm pretty sure the legal definition around that is to be able to understand all of the different elements and to be able to articulate what will happen if you make each decision. When we think about the fundamentals of consent, it's the same that we learn in all sort of areas. It needs to be enthusiastic, ongoing, situation specific. Just because you consent to this COVID vaccine doesn't mean you've consented to the flu vaccine as well. And when we think about our communication descriptors, and being really careful that they're not used as a capacity assessment, they're there to indicate what support a person needs, not to say this person can and this person can't. So situation specific, and depending on the concreteness or the abstractness or that person's experience with something, that can change whether for this particular decision they have capacity to consent for that. So if it's something like moving house, where actually you can take them to go see the new house and they can look at it and then they can come back, you can make it a bit more concrete, they can decide. That's quite different to saying, does the person have capacity to decide if they want to do something with their money or to get a vaccine where they can't see the direct implications, and where there's still a lot of, well, you might still get sick and you might still get really sick, but you might be a bit better, and lots more factors. So we have been trying to be really clear on it's around indicating the type of support based on the situation. It's not about labeling people as capable or incapable. Any other thoughts, I guess, internationally around particularly the vaccine rollout or consent? It's such a big kind of thorny issue.
Where I work, I manage the home. All of our individuals have to have consent from their parent or guardian, or what is it? Oh, like personal power, I guess. Power of attorney, sorry.
Yeah.
So we have to, because they can't say yes or no. Most of them are non-verbal. So we have their parents or power of attorney give that consent with us.
Yeah. And I know that was certainly something that we worked very closely with all in Aotearoa. People have legal welfare guardianship, which, to be honest, the actual legal framework is in review, but kind of defines a person as being wholly capable or wholly incapable, which is just not correct. Yeah. But then there's also a lot of people, particularly the older population, whose parents are of a generation who might have passed away already, or they went into institutions relatively early in life and don't have any family connections. For a lot of people, they weren't able to consent, and there was no kind of next of kin or welfare guardian or power of attorney who could do that on their behalf either.
And that's where our, yeah, you're absolutely right, Hannah. We had significant numbers of people who were not able to clearly indicate their decision, did not have those welfare guardians in place, may have had family members and others, but not with a legal status. And that's where the right 7.2c.ii in our code kind of talks about gaining and gathering the views of 4 suitable persons who've got the best, the vested interests, the welfare, the well-being of the person at heart. And even in that process, it was a process we went through where those 4 people all had to agree it was a good idea, because even if 2 or 1 of those people said, no, don't think it's a good idea, it was halted, and then we kind of reviewed and reconsidered. And sometimes GPs were one of those views, but typically there were non-paid people, family members, and kind of others that had known the person for a really, really long time, and to give the best kind of decision really that we could based at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So vaccines were a big focus, and I think for me a really exciting time where it was so clear that communication is important, and even where a person couldn't give consent, still they have the right to be informed as much as possible about what's going on and what's happening and why that's happening. So we want to create a lot of different resources to inform people with different communication needs. And as the speech therapy team, there's 3 of us for quite a large service. So trying to work efficiently as well and empower other people who are the experts in their roles. We are just, again, helping to facilitate how they can do their roles and communicate it more effectively. So some of the other general communication supports is, like we mentioned, once you understand what a person can understand, you can structure the environment to help kind of clue them in as to what's happening and create more opportunities for decision making. We also use tools like talking mats, which Caroline, I'm sure you'll be familiar with in the UK, but talking mats is a particular kind of communication or a thinking tool that helps to break down some complex things. So often, if you're asking the person like, well, what do you want to do this week? That's a very big question that requires a lot of thinking and remembering of all of the different options that there might be, and then what you want to do. Whereas with a talking mat, you can kind of break that down into the things that you like doing, that you're not sure, and that you don't like doing. So being able to break it down so that the person only has to focus on one thing at a time. Easy read is not necessarily a protected term. There's a lot of different styles that will call themselves easy read. In Aotearoa, we have an organisation called People First, who provide a lot of support and guidance around easy read. So we kind of follow their guidelines. But it's basically, you know, simple written information supported by pictures. And so we had certainly for the vaccine rollout, we had all of that information kind of written out as easy read forms. As the rules and restrictions kept changing, we had those all laid out in easy read format as well. So it can be a lot easier for people who can't read or who have low literacy levels. Or to be honest, even for us, I know that for me, like, you're reading screeds and screeds of information about the new COVID rules, and actually just having it laid out really clearly, one sentence at a time, at the end of a long day where everyone's quite stressed about everything, so much easier to process information when it's laid out simply. Even for those people who can't read and are not interested in looking at this kind of document, actually it provided a really clear and consistent way for support staff to explain what was happening in a way that, you know, when Belinda's on, she's saying the same thing as when Mike is on shift, because they're all getting the information from the same place. So that was one of the key values of using easy read information. And this is one of the tools that we use for those people who do have good language skills and are able to understand kind of complex things around money and COVID rules and all of those sorts of things, how to vote, but just need it in a simple format. Most of us are visual learners. You know, we all use things like PowerPoints and graphs and drawings to kind of help us understand things. And when we're supporting people with disabilities, it's always good to think like, how can they see what's happening rather than just understanding it? So for an example, if you are trying to decide where to live, if you stay where you are, you get on well with your flatmates and you can keep your job. But your bedroom is really small and the house is quite far away from family. The new house is close to shops and close to your family, but it's too far from work, so you have to quit your job and find a new one. Quite a lot of different information to absorb there. Whereas if we can lay that out kind of side by side, one thing at a time, can still have some writing in it, but it just helps us to shift, like, right, I can do option 1 and all these things happen, or I can do option 2 and all these things can happen. So it's just about thinking about how we can show people. We also want to think about breaking things down. So if we think about someone who can understand words and phrases out of context, so they understand things in the future and things in the past, but if you ask them a question like, what sort of job do you want? That's very big and abstract. Whereas if you can break it down into words and phrases, it can be easier to answer. So for instance, what do you think about working inside versus outside? You've now brought that to that kind of level. What do you think about working on your own or working in a big group? So instead of having that one big open question, you be really specific, and then lots of specific questions can feed into all that information you need for a bigger one. So in summary, communication skills and methods are really diverse. Communication is how people access all types of support and is really foundational to how we all engage, not only with our support services, but with all the people around us. Understanding how a person communicates is really foundational for actually creating person-centered support. I often think about it as, you know, we have all our sort of visions and values and the nice sort of fluffy words that we use around being person-centered and all of those sorts of things. And then there's real life. And I think that communication and good communication and understanding communication can be the link between the words that we like to talk about and what we actually do on the ground next week. So I hope that has been sort of helpful and interesting for you guys. I think the key part is knowing how do people communicate, and then you can start to figure out what you can do to support it. I obviously love talking about this stuff. So if you do want to have a chat, or, you know, I can link you to some various other resources and stuff, then definitely get in touch. I'm sure Jackie will send out contact details for us all. But yeah, otherwise that's all for me today. I will stop sharing.
That's been awesome. Thank you, Hannah. That's been really, really helpful. I'm sure others can equally chip in. Yeah, and I've heard Hannah talk about this kind of probably 3 times now, but each time I learn something different. So I think that's part and parcel of why we're all part of this exchange, isn't it? That even if we think we already have a lot of knowledge around a particular subject, or we're experienced, we can still learn from each other as well. So yeah, truly hope that you've enjoyed that, and that there's some parts of it that you think you're able to implement and consider within your organisation. Then yeah, absolutely, Hannah, we'll connect you with the whole group, and we'll definitely share a copy of the recording with a number of people who haven't been able to join us today. We're a little bit out of sequence. We typically do these things on a Wednesday, so that might have thrown a few people, I suspect, as well. Any other comments from anyone?
I did something on the website. It was about communication, and something that I learned was you have to say something 10 different times to get the one idea out, what you're trying to say. And I thought that was quite interesting. And Jackie, when you said you have seen this 3 times now with Hannah, and you learn something new every time, that just came right into my mind.
But 7 more times, Jackie.
Then you'll get it all, Jackie. You'll be able to do this.
Exactly. And it'll be a pleasure, Hannah, to hear it more times as well. And I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will.
And this, so this session is going to connect really nicely with our second session, which is going to be next week. So I'll be putting up the links to that soon. And that session is going to be around how we use our advisory team, our group of people with lived experience of disability, to really hear the voice of people. And also a lot of the strategies that they're using to get information from people is based on the things that Hannah's been talking about. So when we do our My Life surveys, we use talking mats to help people understand, and all of those things sort of connect and weave in quite nicely.
And I often make an effort to try and present with a person with lived experience of disability, which I wasn't able to do today. But certainly we've been trying really carefully to make sure that we're not coming in as sort of the expert speech therapists and telling people how they communicate. But we have gone to the A team, the advisory team, and kind of gotten them to review our communication descriptors as well, particularly around some of the language as well, just making sure that people that it is describing, although it's a small chunk of them who are able to reflect on that kind of thing, you know, that they feel that reflects some of the things that they experience, and some of the things that the people they live with or their peers or their flatmates also experience. And yeah, one of the things we're working towards is also upskilling the A team and facilitating them to do a little bit more of that peer-to-peer support. So again, we are providing them with the tools so that they can go out and do the work and do the connecting, but in a way that's more accessible.
Hannah, would it be okay if we invited a couple of people from our organisation that are working with their peers and you know, trying to engage in a way that's meaningful?
Yeah, absolutely. Get in touch. I'd be very keen to kind of organize something together with Tabitha.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just want to wish you all a wonderful evening. Caroline, I hope you get some wonderful sleep soon. Thank you for sharing your experiences of speech language therapy as well, and hope that you all have an awesome day wherever you are in the world, whatever you're planning on doing.
Hannah, did you want to close us off? I feel like you had a closing.
Yes. Well, let me reshare. Oh,
Oh.
Yeah.
No, that's us.
Sharing. I've shared us. Never mind. Sorry, I was sharing the screen, not the PowerPoint. Okay, you in the right spot now?
Yeah.
All right, so again, just another kind of whakatauki to close us off and kind of bring our energy to the right space at the end. So this one says, ma te kima ka kite, ma te kite ka mahio, ma te kihuia ka marama, which means seek and discover, discover and know and become enlightened. So thank you very much, everyone. Lovely to meet you all.
Have a
Thank
lovely rest of
you.
the day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.